The tragedy of the fires in Southern California is on a scale that the human mind struggles to deal with. I don't really know what to say. My heart goes out to everybody who've lost so much: homes, loved ones, their own lives. But sadly, I'm not surprised. Now, I'm not some Nostradamus who knows the future, and I'm definitely not a Monday morning quarterback. Yeah, I knew. As an architect type, I have a weird and particular knowledge set. And there are those in my circle who've been predicting this exact outcome as inevitable and intended for years. So buckle up. We got some thinking to do.
Architectural Artcast.
In 1980, we had the eruption of Mount St. Helens. The volcano had been signaling for quite some time that an eruption was imminent. So the authorities dutifully issued an evacuation notice for everybody living on and around the volcano. There was an elderly resident who famously refused to evacuate. The vultures in the media would show up on his doorstep every couple days and ask him, "Don't you know the experts are telling us the volcano is going to erupt soon? The authorities have issued an evacuation order. Why aren't you evacuating? Are you too stupid to realize the danger?" And the elderly resident would always give the same answer. "I was born in this house. I grew up in this house. I've lived my whole life in this house. I'm not leaving." In May of 1980, Mount St. Helens did finally erupt, and sadly, the elderly resident and his home were gone. As soon as the dust settled, the ghouls in the media, same thing. At any rate, the ghouls in the media beelined straight back to where that house had been and danced as they looked into the camera and said, "This fool didn't obey, and he paid the price. You, don't be stupid like this fool. Obey." Now, it has to be acknowledged that when it comes to survival, the elderly resident didn't make a wise decision, and he paid the ultimate price. But he wasn't stupid. In architecture, we understand the thought processes that the elderly resident went through, why he made the decision he made. It comes from a concept the Romans described as genus loci. Genus loci is the understanding that every single place is unique, that every single space offers something different, a unique experience that is different from every other space in the world. Our environments affect human behavior, and because every single place is unique, this causes human behavior to be different in every single unique place. Most acknowledge genus loci's effect on the global scale. Mountains, deserts, jungles, the Arctic, all of these environments have a profound effect on how we dress, what we eat, our language, the buildings we build, every aspect of human culture. Genus loci goes way deeper than biomes and groups. Every single space is unique, and that means that every single space has an impact on every single individual that comes into contact with that space. We as humans have the ability to change and modify our environments. But at the same time, those environments are modifying and changing us as individuals. The longer an individual stays in a particular unique place, the more that place changes and modifies that individual, to the point to where that place becomes part of that individual's personal identity. And again, we recognize the environment's influence on the individual on the large scale. We believe that knowing where an individual was born, where they grew up, where they've spent a large percentage of their life will tell us something meaningful about that person. He's an American. She's British. They're from New York. Randy, you're just a hillbilly. Speaking of hillbillies, I haven't lived on a farm in southern Missouri for going on 25 years, but I still identify as a farm boy from southern Missouri. Why? Parts of my family settled in my hometown more than 10 generations ago, where they intermarried with the people already there. For 10 generations, my family has owned, lived on, and farmed the exact same land. Every single aspect of that land, every rock, every tree, every ridge, every hollow, every twist in the creek is connected to my family's history. They all have symbolic meaning. My family is the land is my family. In the early 2000s, my hometown decided in their wisdom that they needed to put a road right through my family's property, right through the old homestead, because a corporation wanted to put a distribution center a piece down the road. When the city burnt down that old Victorian farmhouse, bulldozed the 2 barns, the summer kitchen, the chicken coop, the smokehouse, the tack room, the corn crib, everything else, they weren't just getting rid of a bunch of old buildings. They were destroying a part of history, a part of my family's history, a part of my history. They were destroying a part of me. And come to find out, they were destroying a part of a lot of people. Yeah, the city got their distribution center, and it did bring in money to the town, but the town has never recovered. Come to find out, there is a price to pay for destroying people's history, for destroying people's connection to their environment. Foreshadowing, more on this to come in a bit. Every single one of you out there knows intuitively the power the environment has to influence every single one of us's behavior. Just one example, house hunting. Everybody who's ever gone house hunting has had the experience. You walk in the door and within seconds, you know this is the one. That's why we as a culture differentiate between the 2 terms house, a building, and home, a place where people live. This concept of home, a unique space that's my unique space, is why we as a culture, American culture that is descended from British culture, that's why we as a culture get so pissy with people who come into a unique space that isn't their unique space without permission. When you have an incident where a thief faced consequences from the very people they were trying to steal from, you will oftentimes hear the criticism, they cared more about their stuff than human life. When it comes to burglary, the actual act of stealing is secondary. The primary reason why our culture gets so nasty is genus loci and this concept of home. Our home is our unique space. People will oftentimes leap to the argument, we have the right to control access to our unique space, our home. Others don't have the right to access our unique space, our home, without our permission. Therefore, that's the physical manifestation. It's not the underlying concept. The classic example that is often cited is if somebody goes into a cave that happens to be the den of a mama bear and her cubs. 99.99% of the time, that mama bear is going to feed your corpse to her cubs. Was she all bent out of shape because you didn't knock on the door? Excuse me, do you mind if I come in? No. The issue is vulnerability. One of the most important aspects of home is the idea of safety. We have the right to be safe in our own unique environment, which means we have the right to be vulnerable in our own unique environment. A quick and easy way to illustrate what I mean when I say vulnerable is nudity. The more naked we become, the more vulnerable we are. More importantly, the more vulnerable we perceive ourselves to be. Y'all don't think institutions aren't familiar with this concept, use it for their benefit? Just one example. When you go to the doctor and they have you take off all your clothes and put on that little thin paper robe that easily tears and has your butt hanging out there in the wind, that's intentional. It turns out people who are feeling vulnerable are pliable, easy to control, more willing to follow orders. Like your doctor's orders. In our homes, that unique space that belongs to us, we have the right to be naked and not be vulnerable. More importantly, we have the right to be naked and not feel vulnerable. That's why the infamous shower scene from Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho is still so shocking and unnerving to this day. It's not the violence that's so shocking. We don't actually see the violence directly. What's shocking and unnerving is a woman being violently attacked while she's at her most vulnerable, naked. And she's being attacked in a place that she has the right to be naked and not be vulnerable. This makes us ask the question, are we really safe in our homes, the unique space that belongs to us? This is not a comfortable question to be pondering. This also helps explain why we tend to get real pissy when people come barging into our unique space that we own without permission. It makes us feel incredibly vulnerable, and that ain't a good idea. There's another aspect of vulnerability when it comes to home, specifically if you own your home. Since the end of World War II, homes have become an investment. As prices have skyrocketed, most Americans have a large percentage of their personal wealth tied up in their homes. If anything happens to that house, they're screwed. Homeownership has become the equivalent of that thin paper gown with your butt hanging out in the wind. Incredibly vulnerable. Government, social institutions want Americans to own homes. We'll get into that here in a minute, but because they want all of us to own our home, they've set up social institutions that are supposed to minimize our vulnerability. More importantly, they're supposed to minimize our perception of our vulnerability. So, you're about to invest a large percentage of your family's assets into a building, a house, a unique space that you hope will be your home for a long time to come. How do you know it's a good one? How do you know it won't fall down in 6 months? Codes. Most jurisdictions within the United States, states, counties, and municipalities all have standardized building codes. And most of the time, these building codes are pretty common sense. What building materials can you use to build with? How strong do those materials have to be? How much insulation does your building need? How close can you get an outlet to a bathtub? Pretty straightforward stuff. With a couple of major exceptions, I'm looking at you, California, building codes across the country are pretty much the same. Each jurisdiction has its own idiosyncrasies, but the codes as a whole are pretty much the same. So much so that you can teach them as rules of thumb. You start your design process in the ballpark, and then you go to your specific jurisdiction, your specific building code to fine-tune things. In theory, building codes are supposed to reassure the home buyer. This building, as long as it meets code, meets these standards, that means it's a safe investment, and that this house will be a safe home. It's supposed to minimize the homeowner's vulnerability. Theory, reality, all too often they have nothing in common with each other. I was involved in a pretty high-profile project at one point. The building inspector started to show up every other day, nitpicking this, nitpicking that. Days before we were to turn the keys over, he shows up and announces every single window in every single bedroom didn't meet fire code. They had to be replaced. We got out the code. We measured the windows and showed they were to code. More importantly, and this proved to be key, the windows were manufactured by a major window manufacturer who was selling these windows as meeting the codes of that particular jurisdiction, and the city was recommending those windows as fulfilling their code requirements. The building inspector said, and I quote, "I don't care what the code says. I decide what the code says, and I've decided those windows don't meet code." Everybody in the room knew exactly what was going on. We had two choices. We could take a walk with him out to his truck, and as he got in the truck, we hand him a little envelope, and no more problem. Or two, we replace every single window in that building to his satisfaction. Well, there is a third option, but I don't recommend you go down that road unless you really know what you're doing. We took out every single window, took a chainsaw, rough cut new openings, framed it all in, and then put in the windows that he insisted we use. 2 inches, both ways. The window manufacturer was the one who got pissed when they found out what had happened. They're selling windows to thousands of contractors that are supposed to meet code based upon the city saying they would meet code, but then the city inspectors are failing them because they don't meet code. The contractors would take their business elsewhere. And then we have to ask, why was the city recommending those particular windows in the first place? Nobody likes a politician who doesn't stay bought. When the window manufacturer dug into things, they found one of the local political factions was pissed off at another political faction. And in an act of revenge and retaliation, because somebody in our group was associated with somebody in that political faction, this political faction targeted us, tried to destroy our project. And seeing as how they're going to destroy us anyhow, they figured they might as well empty our wallets while they were at it. Like I said, code started off as a good idea, a mechanism to minimize homeowner vulnerability. Today, more often than not, they're used as nothing more than a political weapon, to further political agendas, to punish political enemies for graft and corruption. If you're connected to the right people, you can build whatever you want. Codes be damned. But if you aren't connected to the right people, you ain't get nothing built. Unless you get connected to the right people. And then see my first comment. Remember how I said that California's building code was completely different from the rest of the country? Well, they're also notorious for having one of the most corrupt and political code enforcement systems in the country as well. In California, it's not good enough to just know the right people. You have to have the right ideology and know the right people who also have the right ideology. If that's the case, you can build whatever you want and you'll never see a building inspector for years. You don't have the right ideology, you ain't building nothing. The next social institution that was set up to try to help alleviate homeowner vulnerability, homeowners insurance. Again, prior to World War II, amazing how much American society was affected by World War II. But prior to World War II, most Americans didn't have homeowners insurance. Homeownership represented a much smaller percentage of your average American's wealth. Yeah, it sucked if something bad happened to your house, but financially, it wasn't that big a deal. You just rebuilt. After the war, as the government pushed more and more Americans into home ownership, real estate prices skyrocketed. Over time, home ownership started to represent a larger and larger percentage of a family's wealth. Now, if something bad happened to your house, not only would you lose your home, you could lose everything, be financially wiped out. Thus, homeowners insurance started to be offered. Homeowners insurance was created to minimize homeowner vulnerability. Today, homeowners insurance exists to make money. They've lost their focus. They've forgotten their priorities. And that's why we have all the problems we have today with insurance companies. On top of all the problems we have with insurance companies, homeowners insurance has become an ideological and political weapon. Government's justification for getting involved with insurance companies in the beginning? Those insurance companies might be up to no good, might be trying to take advantage of innocent people. We need to keep an eye on them. Yeah, but who regulates the regulators? Nowadays, more and more, if a government doesn't want you to have homeowners insurance, you ain't getting homeowners insurance. Another, and arguably the most important social institution that was created to help alleviate homeowner vulnerability was a straight-up social contract that was written into law. The agreement was if the contractors would come in and build the communities, and if people came in and bought the houses, the city, the municipality, whatever, would then collect property tax. And then they would use those property tax to build and maintain the infrastructure. It was a straight up quid pro quo. You provide property taxes, we will provide you roads, sewage, water, electric, schools, hospitals, fire departments, and police. Here's a little detail that most people don't know. In most places, it is written into the law that the money raised from property taxes can only be used for infrastructure and nothing else. More and more governments, they don't care what the law says. They're going to use property tax money on whatever. And these days, more often than not, whatever is ideologically driven. On top of all the misappropriated tax money, on top of the consistent failure to provide the infrastructure that was promised, as exemplified by California these last few days, if all of that wasn't bad enough, property taxes are now also being weaponized for ideological and political reasons. After World War II, the government, politicians along with academia, decided they wanted to get involved in a little social engineering. You see, prior to World War II, they found the American people too hard to control. They, the government, institutions, couldn't do whatever they wanted, like jump into World War II in 1939. They wanted to find a way to make the American people a little more compliant, easier to control. They wanted to make them feel vulnerable, more dependent upon the government, more willing to listen to what the government told them to do. They settled on home ownership. The government and social institutions have spent the last 70 years trying to change the American dream from life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness into a house with a picket fence, a spouse, 2 kids, and 1.5 dogs. The reason why the government, social institutions wanted to change the American dream from a philosophy into a thing, a house, is because a thing is quantifiable. It can be given and it can be taken. You, the American public, if you don't want to lose your American dream, your house, you better do what you're told. American people aren't stupid. They understood the vulnerabilities they were exposing themselves to by home ownership. As a society, Americans weren't rushing headlong to buy houses just because the government was saying, yeah, go buy houses. The government had to sweeten the deal. They had to provide a safety net, mechanisms to minimize the homeowner's vulnerability. More importantly, that would minimize the perception of the homeowner's vulnerability. It worked, and America became a homeowning culture. But last few years, various state and local governments, part of the federal government, have changed their minds. They now no longer want Americans to own their own home. Gee, I wonder why they'd be so hostile to private property. It is now almost impossible for a first-time homebuyer to purchase a home. An entire segment of society has been cut off from home ownership. But we're still stuck with all those pesky existing homeowners. That's where building codes, homeowners insurance, property tax, utilities come in. You start systematically kicking out each safety net in an effort to drive out as many homeowners as possible. The problem with that system, though, it's slow. Just like it took generations for Americans to become homeowners, it's going to take generations to convince them not to be homeowners. To speed things up, you find areas of high risk, say like risk of fire, and then you set up the circumstances so that if that high risk fire comes to pass, you now have the justification to take everybody's homes because they no longer exist. And once you come up with the justification, the next time and the next time and the next time, it becomes easier and easier to take people's property. The problem with all this, all the social engineering, convincing Americans to own homes, and then changing their minds in midstream. No, you don't want to own homes. And then trying to fix it so that they can't own homes. The problem with all this, the government, politicians, institutions, they screwed up big time. Home ownership worked the way that the government, social institutions intended, sort of. It is true that in some ways, Americans became more compliant, easier to control. But in other very important ways, Americans became harder to control, more rebellious, and far more dangerous. And here's the ultimate irony. The government, social institutions knew, or they should have known, that their meddling, the way they chose to do things, the only possible outcome was to make Americans far more dangerous. For them. We go back to World War II and the ongoing debate, why did the American people go from a hardline isolationist stance to overnight demanding war? Pearl Harbor. But what is it about Pearl Harbor that changed the nation's mind instantly? There's one theory that I personally ascribe to, and it has to do with genus loci. You thought I forgot about that? We got to go back to the 30s, the Depression. Millions of people were out of work. Federal government came up with work programs, TVA and lots of others. Teams of men were sent out across the country to build infrastructure, roads, bridges, dams, state and federal parks. These groups of men were inhabiting new, unique spaces. And then they were building, modifying and changing, creating new, unique spaces. They were taking ownership of these spaces. And these spaces, just as they were changing those spaces were changing them. Those spaces became part of their self-identity. When a part of the infrastructure, Pearl Harbor, was attacked and destroyed, every American who had been involved in building America's infrastructure reacted as if a part of them had been destroyed. They interpreted the attack on Pearl Harbor as an attack on them personally. I own the land owns me. Knowing how World War II turned out, the government, social institutions still decided it was a good idea in the name of controlling the population to convince Americans to spend generations buying unique spaces, oftentimes building their own unique space. That's where my profession comes in. And then living in those spaces, sometimes for generations. Americans have spent generations having their self-identity defined by these unique spaces, homes. And then we start to learn to what lengths some in the government are willing to go to take those spaces, destroy those spaces. Yep, they done screwed up. We've reached the point to where people are going to have to die so that ideologues can maintain their ideology. And that's a price ideologues are more than willing to pay. As the fires begin to die down and we come to grips with the tragedy of all of it, the loss of life, the loss of property, the loss of all those unique spaces, mark my words, next couple years, the state of California is going to do everything in its power to ensure that none of those people get their homes back. The state of California has lost all moral authority. They're nothing more than murderers and thieves. But they have the right ideology, so whatever. People keep saying, California's not going to change. Gavin Newsom, Karen Bass, a lot of them, they'll get reelected, just keep doing more of the same. Yeah, probably. But there is going to be a price to pay for this. A major price. It's one thing to burn down the shanty town on the wrong side of town. Who cares about a bunch of poor people? But it's a whole nother thing when you burn down one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the world. Now, a lot of the people in that neighborhood are so wedded to their ideology, they'll accept it. But a lot won't. And then there's everybody watching all this go down, seeing the consequences of letting fanatics and ideologues take control, seeing fanatics and ideologues sipping cocktails while their city burns, interpreting those who are sipping cocktails as attacking them directly. Ask Japan how that strategy worked out for them. At any rate, I hope I've given you all something to think about, and until next time, y'all be safe. If y'all are still here, I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. While you're at it, why don't you like this video, subscribe to the channel, click that notification bell. You can hear me yammer on about something else next time, and feel free to share this video far and wide.
Please like and subscribe. Please leave a comment.